All right. If you're here today for the informational webinar concerning individualized placement and support, you're in the right place. This is for the Indiana Division of Mental Health and Addiction request for funding number 2023-1015. My name is Catherine Hager. I am the Older Persons Initiatives and Supported Employment Director here at DMHA. Teresa?
Hi, good afternoon. Teresa Colazar, Director of the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services, which houses the state's vocational rehabilitation program. Welcome.
All right, for purposes of transcription and for state regulations, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat so we can document them and they can be later posted to the DMHA funding website. The purpose of this webinar is to inform individuals who are interested in applying for the grant, who's eligible, and what IPS is. Just so you all know, before we get into the nitty-gritty, Indiana is moving to an online grant system. It's called eCivis. It's not fully live yet, so if you go to our website and you're like, where is this? It's not live yet. It will be by the time that the application is due at the end of or at the beginning of October. So as you're working towards building the application, just know that the link to the eCivis website will be available to you. And if you want any information on that further about setting up an account, if you're kind of like me and you like to get started early, send me an email so that I'm aware to maybe ensure that our eCivis team is able to outreach to you. But eCivis is an online statewide grants management system. As it closes out, everything, your application, questions, how we process the applications and score the questions will be online. You'll also be notified whether you are awarded or not through that system. What's cool about it is that it in theory will make it more equitable for folks so they know exactly where to go. All of your documents will be stored there. You don't have to worry about your proposal ending up in like a junk folder and someone not seeing it. It'll also hopefully streamline the process for interagency collaboration with the grant approvals, and it should enhance the effectiveness of managing those grants, especially we get so much. DMHA in particular has a lot of federal dollars that go through, so it's just simply easier to track for the state system. And hopefully this is also in line with other grant systems. Many agencies, especially large nonprofits, use grant management platforms, and this will also just be a online grant platform. So you fill out a form, you put in all the necessary information, and then we receive it on our end. And you don't have to worry about your Word document being corrupted. And that is all I know about eCivis at this time. I am still going through the training myself. So again, I encourage you all to anyone who's interested to please forward information over to me if they have any questions about eCivis, and I'll collaborate and see what answers I can find. This is just a brief project description of IPS in Indiana, but DMHA and VR have been coordinating and aligning services to better meet the needs of persons in Indiana with serious mental illness, or SMI. We currently have 2 CMHC early adopter sites that have been instrumental in helping us identify ways that we can improve our systems and just do better at supporting individuals with SMI. They have also been great at supporting us in developing a funding guidance document because, as we'll get into a little bit later, the way we do the funding for this program is critical to the sustainability of it. And really us honing in on and developing a process or a provider manual for supported employment is just necessary. And I think
So I think Kate really hit on most of this. You'll see if you're interested and you're looking at the RFF, do pay attention to Appendix A. That is gold. That was developed with a lot of great collaboration between Medicaid, mental health, and VR. in terms of how those dollars across the systems can be used in tandem. We tend to use the term braiding and sequencing of those dollars. Our early adopter sites have both agreed that the ability to braid those dollars is very critical to the S case of the sustainability of IPS. And I think, not just sustainability, not just a break even point, but I think people coming out, on the other end financially, with the approach of braiding those. There's also some great opportunity because of that guidance document that people are able to initiate some employment services while they're waiting to initiate VR services. Sometimes that there's a little bit of a turnaround time there, and people don't need to wait. There's some ways that they can begin IPS while they're in the process of being referred to VR. So we mentioned the funding guidance document, and specifically you'll see in there vocational rehabilitation funding, as well as MRO or Medicaid rehabilitation option. So MRO, I think historically there's maybe been, I don't know, fair to say a lack of clarity or an uncertainty in the variety of ways that MRO is allowable to support individuals to overcome symptoms that are interfering with employment. And so sometimes there's been a thought process that MRO can't be used to support employment, but I say yes. I say it can. It can when it's approached from that standpoint of, these are areas that are serving as barriers for this individual because of mental health diagnosis. These are things that are interfering with their ability to prepare for jobs, find employment, stay employed. And so MRO can be used to address or mitigate those barriers. Those are focused on illness management and recovery. It does not matter what the setting is. So the setting could be an employment setting, right? For instance, in addition to other community settings or the community health center, mental health center itself. Treatment plans should address a person's interest and desire to work. Oftentimes we have systems that may sometimes come off as discouraging work or helping people or feeling like maybe people need to be quote unquote stable, or something needs to happen first with your condition before you go to work. And really the research tells us that work is a very important part of someone's recovery. So employment should be integrated into the treatment process and discussed early and often. VR, or vocational rehabilitation, for those who maybe aren't as familiar with our end of the project here, we support folks with all types of disabilities, including those with mental health diagnosis, to achieve employment. We provide services based on, like most organizations, a plan of sorts, right? A service plan. Ours happens to be called individual placement and, individual plan for employment, or IPE, not to be confused with IPS. And the voc rehab counselor and the individual work together on that plan to identify the targeted employment outcome that hopefully best aligns with the individual's, preferences, their skills, things they want to avoid, work settings that they can be most successful in order to help them either prepare for employment. That might mean some training, that might mean some assistive technology, regaining or going back to work, advancing in employment. Maybe they're already working and there's an opportunity for them to increase their hours or move into a career pathway, ultimately to secure employment, again, that matches those preferences, strengths, interests, informed choice, etc. All right. Some of the challenges that we've learned, and I think some of these are some ongoing challenges, and then there's other challenges that I think we've been able to really tackle and resolve with our 2 early adopter sites. One of them probably won't be surprising to anybody listening in today is the staffing capacity, or the ability to hire and retain employment specialists for the IPS project within our early adopter sites. Um, the other lesson that we've learned is that not only do we need to keep staff, but the staff need to be knowledgeable, which could happen through training, or maybe they come in with that knowledge, but they do need to be knowledgeable about multiple different funding streams. So again, that braiding and sequencing, particularly of MRO and VR dollars, is really critical. So someone really needs to, be competent and have some level of knowledge across both of those different funding streams. And applicants can address workforce challenges by addressing these strategies for recruiting and retaining staff members. So we would love to hear from folks who may be listening, who might be applying. We recognize, again, this is a challenge. So interested in your strategies for how you will recruit and retain. These are generally pretty small projects within our early adopter site, so they may only have one employment specialist. So if you have turnover there, that really kind of shuts down your whole project. And so having those strategies to retain your staff or replace staff are really, really critical to the success of even being able to, carry out the project, let alone do that with good fidelity.
The project requirements are pretty straightforward, I think. For the CMHC that's interested, please have a letter of commitment from yourself that employment is a part of recovery. I understand many CMHCs have been involved in supporting employment in the past, so I don't think that's a large thing to get, but it is necessary to just ensure that we have commitment to competitive employment from the top down at the agency, because that's really what kind of underlines the success and the opportunities that are afforded people with serious mental illness. We ask that you employ at least one full-time equivalency employment specialist. It just helps support the program. The employment specialist should spend at least 65% of their time within the community. Uh, and there needs to be some capacity for the CMHC to submit monthly reports for their claims. Most of our community mental health centers are rock stars at this, but I do know that right now with workforce as it is, that may be a challenge. We'll also need to participate within an annual review for the IPS fidelity review. I promise they're not as scary as they seem. And everybody that provides these reviews are fantastic and provide really good feedback. And especially for someone that is just starting out, these are not punitive. You're not going to be withheld any money. It is just to see where you're at and how we can improve things in the future. Um, as well, because of the funding source, the eligible participants must have serious mental illness and need to be eligible for MRO. I know that conflicts a little bit with IPS, but as the state really builds up this program, I think we need to just remember that this particular funding source, they need to have SMI, and that is within the RFF. Doesn't need to mean that they have to have MRO. But we have found that that tends to be where CMHCs are able to make this fiscally sustainable. There also needs to be a written commitment to meeting with VR and DMHA state leadership on at least a quarterly basis to provide updates. I think this is a great talking point where we can identify best ways to move forward if there are pain points within the program. Um, just by nature of IPS, it is a shift and it is a different way of doing business. So I think just these quarterly updates are a great way for us to identify and help support the agency as they transition.
Okay, so getting into the funding piece of the project requirements, we've mentioned a couple of times the braiding of different funding sources. One key source is vocational rehabilitation funding. For those who may have worked with VR in the past as an employment provider, you are likely familiar with our milestone outcome funding approach to employment services. We also have hourly funded services or fee for service that can supplement those milestone activities. So the only thing different here for IPS is that with the hourly services, we have created a specific, an elevated IPS rate for things like hourly IPS supported employment services, hourly IPS job placement. And then the career profile also done at an hourly basis. So our typical hourly rate for traditional VR services is currently $50 an hour. For the IPS hourly services, that is currently at $70 an hour. So a pretty significant increase there. Otherwise, the milestones that we use, milestone 1, 2, and 3. Milestone 1 is for 1 week on the job. Milestone 2 is 4 weeks on the job. And then milestone 3 is when the individual has reached their highest level of independence or stabilization on the job and been able to sustain at that level for 90 days, then milestone 3 kicks in. So those 3 milestones are handled the same way and at the same rates as our traditional VR services. So there's a little graphic here that walks you through that. There's also an attachment to the RFF that goes through that in just a little bit more detail. Moving on a little bit more on the VR funding front here. What else might be a little bit different? In the traditional VR process, we go through, for many folks, what's called discovery or kind of an assessment phase. For some people, that might be very quick. For others, it might be much lengthier. With IPS, one of the principles is rapid engagement. And so we don't want these long upfront exploration processes. So there's no discovery period with IPS. Rather, we have a career profile that is developed in pretty short order with the individual to give enough guidance to determine what type of, again, employment outcome makes sense for that person to pursue. The career profile is billable to both VR funding and MRO. So this is a great example of how someone can get started with that career profile, even if they have not yet applied or been determined eligible for VR. If they are in VR, when they begin this process, then we will be the go-to payer. But oftentimes, again, someone might decide today they're interested in employment, and if the CMHC has an employment specialist who can start that process with them in a few days or a couple weeks, more than likely they're not going to have gone through the whole VR application process in that amount of time. But no worries, they can still start that career profile process through MRO. And then we talked about the hourly, which is paid at 70 instead of 50. IPS, again, not to beat a dead horse here, but that braiding and sequencing is also very important because while IPS is an evidence-based service, is an evidence-based approach, there really isn't a dedicated funding, single source of dedicated funding for IPS. And so where it's working in the 25 or so states across the nation that are carrying out IPS is where, again, they're leveraging and braiding dollars across different funding streams. Again, I'm going to reference the funding guidance document. There is one included. Our current version of that is included with the RFF. We're always looking to make that better and more detailed and comprehensive. So we anticipate we'll have just the next revision of that document right around the time the project would kick off here in January 2024. Again, that provides guidance on which specific activities are allowed to be billed to MRO and VR, and if the person is engaged in both, who would be the primary, who would be the initial funder. It spells that out as well. And then depending on the services the individual with mental health diagnosis may be eligible for, you could find that this is a person who maybe where MRO is the only option, at least right now, because maybe they haven't gone through the VR process yet, or they don't want to, or maybe VR is the only funding option because, again, they're not eligible for MRO or haven't finished that process, or the person is actually eligible simultaneously for both. And that, again, is where the guidance document will specify who's on first. The only thing braiding and sequencing is not double dipping, right? There's still no double dipping here. The same unit of service cannot be billed twice. The funding guidance document just helps to outline which activities can be billed or not to each funding source and who would be that initial payer if, again, both sources were available for the same activity.
So, project requirements are pretty straightforward. Project must follow IPS core principles, of which there are 8, and they are fairly clearly defined. However, Indiana is exploring ways in which we can ensure that these fit the needs of both the members and the capacity of the CMHCs as well as the state of Indiana. I'll read these off just in case you are unfamiliar with IPS, but there needs to be competitive employment. You can't just put people into sheltered workshops or into the same type of work. Like there's an easy business opportunity. You've got a good relationship with the store and they just always take people. It needs to be person centered in terms of finding them the right kind of service. Included is systematic job development, rapid job search, integrated services, and that includes how the CMHC is structured. And I think this is where those quarterly meetings come in and a lot of use is identifying where some of those pain points are and ensuring that fidelity is met in terms of how those services are provided within the agency and who has access to them, because everyone should. Benefits planning, zero exclusion goes to everybody who wants supported employment, or IPS receives IPS. Doesn't matter if what their severity is, what their mental illness or what their diagnosis is, where they're at. They get those services right then and there to help prepare them for the workforce. As well, time unlimited supports and also the worker preferences. These are also pretty straightforward due to the funding nature and due to the way that we just have funding in the state of Indiana. They need the eligible participants for this grant are certified Indiana community mental health centers. And the CMHC needs to be an approved VR service provider for the provision of employment services or written assurance that the CMHC will register to become a VR provider of employment services within 45 days. There also needs to be a commitment to zero exclusion to IPS. This is one that we tend to drive home pretty hard, and this was also a hard one because it is a paradigm shift. Although the supported employment team may be very passionate, that may not be across the CMHC. So we are hope to provide as much technical assistance and support as we can as the agency, as the as the supported employment team work towards zero exclusion across the agency. All right, these are the important dates. So written proposals shall be submitted to the eCivis web portal no later than like 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, October 2nd, 2023. And I strongly encourage any applicant to at least start their application process in advance. As soon as that link is up, please start the application just in case there's any hiccups along the line. You can notify me in case there's submission issues, whatever it may be. But from my understanding and in the screen shares that I've seen, um, once you log in and have your access the site, if when you click apply, like if you were to click at like 11:59, that's going to be too late because you still have to do all of the stuff in the form. So I encourage you to work in advance of that due date and do everything you need to do because it is an online system, it's new for everybody. All portions of the proposal are going to be entered into the eCivis platform. And there's also some additional stuff that they're putting in there that you traditionally may not see within the DMHA. Like previously, if you've ever submitted a grant application to DMHA, you've got the little form, you fill it out and you send it over to an email. In this new system, there are some additional things you might have to track down. Again, another reason why to get started early. So you'll need to, underneath the state budget category, you have to enter in health and human services. You'll need to determine your state legislative district and the area that's impacted by that legislative district, including the congressional legislative district and who is impacted by that and within that congressional legislative district. You also need to know your billing bidder number and your supplier vendor ID number. I believe that should be usually housed within like the grants applicants with like in the CMHC. I don't know how else to phrase it, but there's usually folks that are aware of that within your CMHC. So ask around and get that. You should be able to get it. the other dates to be aware of, I think for this particular grant, you still need to email me for the questions. In the future of eCivis, that'll all be done within the platform. But since this grant's kind of doing a weird hybrid, you'll need to email me questions and I will post them up onto the website on, I believe, sorry, I've lost my space, but they'll be posted to the website. But you'll need to ask all questions, forward them to me in an email. And please put in the subject line questions for RFF number 2023-015. That'll just help me trigger it and make sure that I put and answer all of the questions and post them online. Next
That
slide.
date is September 8th, Kate.
Thanks. Yep, September 8th. Sorry. This is just the timeline of everything. It was released August 1. The informational webinar is today. The questions are due August 25th to me, again, in email. The RFF answers will be posted September 8th, and the proposal submissions are due on eCivis, again, on eCivis, October 2nd, 2023. We'll notify applicants via eCivis for the award determination by October 13th, 2023. And I believe that will be an email coming from eCivis. So previously you'd get a letter from DMHA, me, but now it'll all be done in eCivis. So check your spam folders too. Like or if you don't get something and you're like, oh, what was it? Check your spam folder, and if you're not sure, email me and we'll figure it out. All right, the project start date. So the contracts, scope of work, all of that should start January 1 of 2024, and the project end will be December 31st, 2025. And the funding is from the Mental Health Block Grant. Each awarded agency will receive upwards of $160,000 for 2 years of the funding. We strongly encourage, and you'll see this in the RFF scoring proposal, that we do wait for the budget to reflect weaning from the grant funds to the braided and sequenced funding. And we're seeking up to 2 grantees this round. And so here you'll see the proposal content scoring criteria. Eligibility, you've got to be a CMHC and be able to bill MRO. That's just the reality at this time. Please identify the extent of need, the population served, and your plan of operation. And this includes identifying strengths and weaknesses within the 8 IPS principles. This is not necessarily a punitive area. We just want to see where our IPS state trainer can support your agency on working up towards IPS fidelity. Within the budget template and cost effectiveness, you may see some weights for, we do ask that you consider and reflect on moving from state grant funding to the braided and sequenced funding to sustain the program in the future. Competitive integrated employment. There are 3 required components that must be met to satisfy the definition of competitive integrated employment. That includes competitive wages to access employer provided benefits in an integrated setting, and that means everybody from people with disabilities to folks that don't have disabilities are present on the job and in different levels of the job. And there are also opportunities for the person to advance. These 3 criteria are further defined in the RFF. The individual's placement must meet all criteria for VR to provide payment. I think that's really critical. Like MRO is, you can kind of get them a job anywhere, but really for VR, that competitive integrated employment is central and super important. Serious mental illness for this grant is any person above the age of 18 years old who at any time given a year has had a diagnosable mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that meets the criteria within the DSM. They also need to have at least 1 functional impairment that interferes or limits major life activities. This does not include substance use disorder alone or some other codes within the DSM that kind of relate to social determinants of health. SAMHSA is very specific on this. And we do understand and recognize that there is a gap for folks who have substance use disorder but may not have a corresponding SMI diagnosis. That is something we're aware of at the state. Just be aware that because of this funding source, that is the reality of the eligibility. Within the budget template, my understanding is within eCivis, you will enter this aspect of the RFF may not actually be applicable because you'll be entering in your budget within eCivis. When I wrote this grant up, I was unaware of that. So just know that you'll be entering in the budget within eCivis. And it'll look pretty similar to any other budget that you do, from my understanding. The attachment guidance should be on our, attachment A is the funding guidance that we provided all of our providers. There will be a revised one coming up in January. So if you are an applicant and you are curious to know what the new swanky funding guidance looks like with fun examples and some troubleshooting opportunities to explore and read about, you'll get that in January.
Just a couple more things, and we're in the home stretch here. I just wanted to mention this next piece because it's very timely with the issuance of this RFF, this request for funding for additional early adopter IPS sites. In the VR world over here, we've been working on a variety of different strategies and initiatives aimed at just overall improvement in employment outcomes for the folks that we're serving, which again certainly includes folks with mental health diagnosis. We'd love to see, the average wages go up, the work hours that people are working, and just generally seeing more people with, employer offered benefits, healthcare in particular, people moving down career pathways, not getting past those initial jobs and really going down sustainable and buildable career pathways. So to do that, we are going to implement, we have this past month implemented a new initiative. And in addition to that primary objective of improving and maximizing employment outcomes for our participants, it also provides some additional financial resources or incentives to support providers in driving people toward those outcomes. There's a few different options. You'll see here kind of a tiered structure as we move to the next slide that hopefully provides multiple opportunities for incentive reimbursement for providers. So on this slide here, there are two tables. On the left are the benchmarks or criteria, and then on the right are the payment levels. So all of these criteria, I won't spend a lot of time. I'm going to go through this pretty fast. If you are interested, there is a link here that will take you to the VR Employment Services webpage. We did a whole webinar on these performance incentive payments, so you can review that. We also have an addendum to our Employment Services Manual that outlines all of these new incentives. Just very quickly, employment outcomes that a provider supports the individual, the participant in achieving. If that outcome meets one or two or three of these different criteria, there is an additional payment available to that provider. So nothing about our current payment structure is changing. Still support people no matter what their competitive integrated employment outcome is, whether that's part-time work, full-time work, minimum wage, well above minimum wage, $40 an hour, whatever the case might be. We still have the funding streams to support those outcomes through our milestone outcome payments and then the hourly billing we mentioned earlier. This is extra money, right? This is additional on top of our current structure. So if the outcome meets an hourly wage of at least $15.78 an hour, that's one criteria met. If the outcome meets 30 or more hours of work per week, that's another area where some reimbursement can occur. And then if the employment outcome is with an employer who is offering private health insurance to that individual, again, that's another benchmark or criteria that would warrant result in some additional reimbursement to the provider. So any one of these three that is met, the additional funding is $226. Any two that are met is $791 in additional funding. And if all three of these criteria are hit with that outcome, $1,356 is the additional funding available to the provider. For those familiar with our milestone structure, if someone hits all three milestones, that's $5,500. If the outcome then meets these three criteria, it's about a 25% additional beyond those milestones if that $1,356, if all three are hit. The only other thing I'll say about here is, why did we pick those levels? The hourly wage, $15.78, is the 2022 living wage in Indiana for a single, no children, just one single person household. That should be the minimum, we're striving for. The hours per week and the health insurance, I kind of talk about as a little bit of a duo because they are somewhat paired together. Under the Affordable Care Act, employers, now this probably does not apply this doesn't apply to very small employers, but in general, most employers are required to provide health insurance to their employees if they are at full-time status. Full-time status is defined as at least 30 hours per week. So that kind of addresses the hours set at the 30 hours. And then again, the private or the health insurance offered through the employer. Kate, anything to add before we wrap up?
Nope, just saying if anybody has any questions, especially in regards to eCivis, please email me. Those are just confidential questions. You don't have to worry about those being posted to the website. But if you do have an RFF specific question, please put the name of the RFF in the title or the subject line of the email, and I'll be happy to put those up on the website so that all applicants have the similar or the same resources available. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.